What happens to an idea when it arrives before its time? Does it wait patiently, or does it vanish, folded into rumor, memory, and unfinished notebooks? History often presents itself as a clean line of progress, but beneath that line runs a quieter current, inventions whispered about, experiments abandoned, insights that flickered and went dark. This story begins not with a single machine or moment, but with a question that has followed humanity for centuries. Are there discoveries that changed everything and then quietly disappeared? Not because they failed, but because the world around them was not ready to change. Imagine a workshop late at night. The air smells of metal and oil. A lone inventor listens closely, not just to gears or wires, but to possibility itself. Outside, the world moves according to familiar rules. Inside, those rules are being tested. History remembers the successes that fit neatly into existing systems. It forgets or misplaces the rest. We like to believe that knowledge is inevitable, that once something is discovered, it cannot be undiscovered. But history suggests otherwise. Libraries have burned. Languages have vanished. Techniques once mastered have been lost and relearned centuries later. Progress is not a straight road. It is a landscape shaped by culture, economics, fear, and hope. Throughout the modern age, there have been moments when innovation brushed against something deeper. Questions about energy, health, matter, gravity, even time itself. Some of these moments were recorded imperfectly. Others survived only in testimony, sketches, or second-hand accounts. Over time, they became stories. And stories, when repeated without care, harden into myths. This series does not claim certainty. It does not promise hidden truths or secret powers waiting to be unleashed. Instead, it offers something quieter and perhaps more honest, a meditation on curiosity, suppression, misunderstanding, and the fragile relationship between discovery and society. We will explore inventions that were said to challenge assumptions about how energy flows, how bodies heal, how matter behaves, how humanity moves through space. Some were likely misunderstood. Some may have been exaggerated. Others might represent genuine insights that were never fully explored. What matters is not whether every claim holds up to modern scrutiny, but what these stories reveal about us. Why do certain ideas make us uncomfortable? Why are some paths pursued relentlessly while others are abandoned? Sometimes the reason is simple practicality. Sometimes it is skepticism. Sometimes it is fear of disruption, of loss, of a future that arrives too quickly. Each chapter in this journey begins with a scene, a laboratory, a field, a solitary figure wrestling with forces they only partially understood. We will follow these moments not as detectives hunting for proof, but as listeners, attentive to the human longing beneath the machinery. This is not a story about villains and heroes. It is about tension, between imagination and acceptance, between possibility and permission, between what can be envisioned and what can be lived with. As you listen, you may feel moments of wonder, doubt, even frustration. That is intentional. The goal is not to convince, but to invite reflection, to ask how many ideas never reached their full expression, not because they were wrong, but because they did not align with the world that surrounded them. At the end of this journey, we may not know whether these inventions were truly erased, quietly set aside, or simply overtaken by other paths. But we may understand something more enduring, that human progress is shaped as much by what we choose not to pursue as by what we embrace. And perhaps the most important question is not what was lost, but what kinds of ideas we are still overlooking today. It began with a tower reaching into the sky, rising from the quiet shores of Long Island. Shaped like a transmission beacon from some forgotten future, the Wardenclyffe Tower was Nikola Tesla's boldest dream, rendered in wood, steel, and ambition. At its heart pulsed a vision, a world connected by invisible waves, powered not by wires or fuel, but by the energy of the Earth itself. Tesla believed energy was all around us, embedded in the fabric of space, humming in the air, coursing through the ground. He called it radiant energy, and he had a plan to harness it. Wardenclyffe wasn't just a radio tower. It was a gateway to a new civilization, one where electricity flowed freely and endlessly to anyone with a tuned receiver. In 1899, he demonstrated the idea. Lamps glowed without wires, motors turned without plugs. The air itself carried power. Crowds gasped as entire neighborhoods lit up from energy drawn, it seemed, out of nothing. No wires, no coal, no oil, just resonance, his tower in harmony with the Earth's own electric rhythm. But that same year, the funding stopped. J.P. Morgan, who had backed the project, realized what was truly at stake. If anyone can draw on the power, he is said to have asked, where do we put the meter? For Morgan, and for the empire of industry he represented, Tesla's dream was not an opportunity. It was a threat. Within 2 years, the tower was dismantled. Tesla's lab was shuttered. His papers were confiscated after his death. The system that promised to end energy scarcity was buried beneath national security orders and forgotten by a world moving deeper into the age of fossil fuels. But what if Tesla had succeeded? What would a world without energy monopolies look like? No electric bills, no oil wars, no coal-choked skies, just a hum, a silent, invisible current connecting all life like a circulatory system made of light. Independent researchers tried to recreate Tesla's vision in the decades that followed. Some claimed to succeed, if only for moments, before their devices were seized, their labs closed, their work silenced. More than 5,000 patents related to alternative energy remain classified, not because they didn't work, but perhaps because they worked too well. It is tempting to see this as conspiracy. Easier, perhaps, to believe in suppression than in scientific error. But maybe the truth lies somewhere in between. Tesla's ideas were radical, difficult to replicate, incomplete even by his own admission. But they were not without merit, and they raised a question that still lingers. What if energy could be free? Not just in cost, but in spirit. What if power didn't require permission? What if it flowed like air or sunlight, open, available, and shared? Tesla dreamed of such a world, and for a moment he built it, a tower rising into the sky, resonating with the earth, offering light without fire, connection without wires. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. Today, we remember him as a genius out of time, but perhaps he was also a mirror, reflecting what we could have been had we chosen a different path. Not one of scarcity, but of abundance. Not one of control, but of release. Tesla didn't just invent machines. He imagined new ways of living. And that may be why his greatest invention disappeared, not because it failed, but because it asked too much of the world around it. What are we willing to lose in order to keep what we've always known? The room was silent except for the soft hum of machinery. At the center stood a microscope, unlike any the world had seen, not made for the dead slides of pathology, but for living motion. Under its lens, viruses danced, flickered, responded. Dr. Royal Raymond Rife watched them not as static shapes, but as dynamic beings. And more than watching, he listened. It was the 1930s. Medicine was changing, consolidating, professionalizing. But Rife was after something deeper, the very frequency of disease. Through a revolutionary optical system, his microscope reached magnifications unheard of over 60,000 times. It allowed him to witness something stunning, that every microorganism had a resonant frequency like a musical note. And like glass shattered by a perfect pitch, these organisms could be destroyed with sound. Rife developed frequency generators that targeted cancer cells, delivering precise electromagnetic pulses tuned to their unique vibrations. In 1934, a clinical trial at the University of Southern California treated 16 terminal cancer patients. Within 2 months, 14 were declared free of cancer. The other 2 recovered with adjusted treatments. A 100% recovery rate. Quietly, astonishingly, it had worked. Then the silence deepened. Before results could be published, Dr. Milbank Johnson, who oversaw the trials, died suddenly. All records vanished. Rife's work became a ghost. The American Medical Association dismissed the findings. Journals refused to publish. Supporters lost their funding. The momentum collapsed, replaced by a wall of silence and skepticism. In 1939, agents raided Rife's lab, destroying his equipment. The frequency devices, simple, elegant, and powerful, were seized or dismantled. Doctors who used them were threatened with license revocation. What had promised to upend modern oncology became instead a cautionary tale whispered in shadows. Why? The answer, many believe, lies in the economics of medicine. By the 1940s, cancer treatment had grown into a billion-dollar industry. Chemotherapy, radiation, surgery, all profitable, all industrialized. A small, affordable device that cured cancer without drugs, without pain, and without prolonged treatment. It was too disruptive, too democratic. Rife spent the rest of his life defending his invention. Lawsuits, betrayals, and legal battles wore him down. Others who tried to replicate his work faced similar fates. Labs closed, lives lost. And yet echoes of Rife's work continue. Independent researchers have explored frequency-based therapies. Anecdotes persist. But the mainstream never returned to the question, can illness have a sound? And if so, can it also have a silence imposed not by science, but by systems? Rife's microscope wasn't just a tool. It was a window into a different kind of medicine, one guided not by chemistry alone, but by resonance. A medicine that listens, that attunes, that harmonizes. What might have happened if we had followed that path? What if, instead of declaring war on disease, we had tried to tune it away? There's no definitive answer. The machines are gone, the data erased. But the memory lingers, a story not just of invention, but of resistance, of how a single idea can come too close to a system that isn't ready to bend. We often think of science as a quest for truth, but sometimes it's also a negotiation with economics, with institutions, with fear. And when those forces outweigh the evidence, even healing itself can be silenced. So the question remains, not just whether Rife was right, but whether we were ready to listen. In a quiet hangar in the early 1950s, a strange hum filled the air. No propellers, no engines, no fuel. Just disks, shaped like flattened bells, hovering under their own power, propelled by nothing visible. They drifted, then darted, responding to adjustments in voltage, not throttle. Thomas Townsend Brown stood nearby, watching electricity do what no one thought it could: defy gravity. Brown had stumbled on the effect decades earlier. As a teenager, he noticed that high-voltage capacitors moved toward one electrode, ever so slightly, but undeniably. It was a force unaccounted for. He called it electrogravitics. The idea was radical, that electricity and gravity were not separate, but deeply linked. By 1928, he had refined the effect. By the early 1950s, he was flying devices, small, disc-shaped capacitors that lifted themselves through the air. They needed no fuel. They had no moving parts. The thrust came from interaction between electric charge and gravitational fields. Or so Brown believed. To the public, it was science fiction, but to the military, it was something else entirely. The Air Force and Navy quietly took interest. Projects were launched, funding secured. Names like Project Winter Haven hinted at something buried in cold secrecy. Brown demonstrated his technology in classified briefings. His discs moved, fast, silent, maneuverable. He envisioned aircraft that hovered, spacecraft that soared without rockets, and transport systems free from fuel. Then the doors closed. The research was classified. Public access ended in 1956. Brown's patents were seized. His conversations became guarded. Outside the labs, his name faded. Inside, rumors of secret craft, silent, agile, began to circulate. Mainstream science dismissed the effect. They said it didn't work, or that it was merely ion wind. But something didn't add up. Aviation Week reported in 1956 that major aerospace firms were quietly exploring electrogravitics. The patents existed, the demonstrations happened, but the conversation had moved behind locked doors. What would flight look like if gravity could be manipulated? No jet fuel, no combustion. Just silent motion, clean, efficient, and almost alien in its simplicity. Brown dreamed of a world where ships could lift off like dandelion seeds in an electric breeze. A world of floating cities, effortless transport, and planetary exploration. But like so many dreams that challenge the known order, his was absorbed by forces he could not control. Defense, secrecy, power. And yet, the allure remains. Every so often, a story surfaces. A craft that moved too silently, accelerated too quickly, hovered without wings. They are dismissed, misidentified, or buried in red tape. But to those who remember Brown's work, they feel familiar. What if the technology never disappeared, only reappeared under different names, in darker corners? Brown died in 1985, still forbidden to speak openly about what he had built, still believing that electricity and gravity were lovers long misunderstood. The promise of electrogravitics is not just propulsion, it's liberation from fossil fuels, from atmospheric limits, from the weight that holds us down. And the tragedy is not only in what was hidden, but in what might have soared. We often measure scientific worth by what can be seen, touched, replicated. But some truths are not lost to time. They're lost to secrecy. Not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well. So we're left wondering, what if gravity is not a constant, but a conversation? And what if someone, long ago, learned how to whisper back? In a Philadelphia workshop in the 1870s, music filled the air, not from instruments, but from machinery. John Worrell Keely stood beside his strange device, tuning forks in hand, coaxing vibration into motion. Before a small audience, he struck a note, and massive iron weights lifted as if gravity had momentarily forgotten its role. No steam, no fuel, only sound. Keely called it sympathetic vibration. He believed that within all matter existed a hidden force, an etheric energy that could be unlocked by resonance. His motor didn't burn anything. It sang, and through its harmonies it moved metal, powered tools, turned shafts. It was a machine that lived in rhythm, not combustion. Observers were astonished. The motor ran for hours with no visible power source. Keely struck tuning forks, adjusted resonators, and the engine responded. It seemed to breathe in harmony with the world, drawing on some unseen reservoir of motion. Investors flocked to fund the Keely Motor Company, drawn by the promise of infinite energy from sound itself. A technology that could replace coal, steam, and oil effortlessly. But as the demonstrations continued, so did the pressure. Investors wanted blueprints, explanations. Keely offered metaphors and mysticism. He spoke of molecular chords and cosmic rhythms. Science demanded diagrams. Keely offered music. When he refused to reveal his full method, suspicion grew. Rumors of fraud circulated. After his death in 1898, skeptics claimed to find hidden tubes in his lab, compressed air systems concealed behind walls. They declared him a charlatan. But others argued the discovery was orchestrated by those who had the most to lose. Some physicists would later revisit his ideas with the language of quantum mechanics and zero-point energy. They found echoes of Keely's work in modern explorations of vacuum fluctuations, harmonic resonance, and energy fields too subtle for 19th-century science to grasp. Perhaps he wasn't a fraud, but a poet of physics, one whose vocabulary came before the dictionary had been written. Today, the Keely motor remains a symbol of what might have been, and of how fragile the boundary is between genius and delusion in the absence of understanding. What if he had been right? Imagine a world where sound, not fire, moves machines, where vibration replaces combustion, where energy hums gently from every material, waiting to be tapped. Such technology would not just change industry, it would change how we perceive reality itself. But perhaps the world wasn't ready for a machine that needed to be played, not operated. Keely's story is a reminder. Not all innovation is linear. Some ideas arrive wrapped in metaphor and mystery and music, and sometimes society needs the right ears before it can hear them. In the end, Keely was not silenced by failure, but by disbelief. His motor fell into obscurity, his notes scattered, his vision ridiculed. But maybe, just maybe, he tuned into something real. And if so, the question is not whether it worked, but whether we were willing to listen. To a world where machines don't roar, but resonate. Where energy is not consumed, but revealed. The basement lab flickered with arcs of violet-blue light, a theater of raw electricity. Coils crackled, fields pulsed invisibly in the air. And in the middle of it all, Canadian inventor John Hutchison stood transfixed, not by what he had built, but by what was happening without explanation. In 1979, while experimenting with overlapping electromagnetic fields, Tesla coils, Van de Graaff generators, and RF transmitters, Hutchison stumbled onto something extraordinary. Objects levitated. Metal fused with wood without heat. Steel twisted like clay. Materials transmuted. The known laws of physics didn't apply. He hadn't designed this effect. He discovered it like an unexpected chord in a chaotic symphony. The Hutchison effect, as it came to be called, was not a single phenomenon, but a cascade of anomalies, weightless objects, sudden material softening, spontaneous movement, unexplained energy emissions. Videos captured the impossible, metal bars warping, items lifting from tables and hovering, seemingly immune to gravity. Spectators included scientists, military personnel, and skeptics alike. Colonel John Alexander, a U.S. Army official, reportedly witnessed materials behaving in ways that defied standard models. Still, the effect remained elusive, beautifully unpredictable, difficult to reproduce on demand. That unpredictability may have been its downfall. By 1990, Hutchison's lab was raided. His equipment was seized by Canadian authorities. The reason? National security concerns. Officially, electromagnetic interference. Unofficially, something far more potent. The fear of technology that didn't fit into known frameworks, military, industrial, or academic. Rumors swirled. Some claimed that elements of Hutchison's work were absorbed into black-budget defense programs. Others said it was dismissed entirely, too erratic to harness. Hutchison, eccentric and unpolished, lacked the institutional allies to defend his findings. His experiments were dismissed as flukes or trickery. The videos labeled hoaxes. The man marginalized. And yet, the footage remains. The testimonies persist. And the questions linger. What if fields can be tuned to alter matter itself? What if gravity, solidity, and inertia are not constants, but variables, shaped by harmonies of energy most of us cannot yet perceive? Hutchison may have glimpsed the edge of a physics we don't yet understand, a realm where matter bends to field, where the rules of Newton and Einstein pause, and something stranger takes hold. If true, the implications are profound. Transportation without friction, manufacturing without heat, clean energy, material synthesis, even reality modification. And if false, if it was all error, coincidence, or illusion, then why the urgency to silence it? Why remove the machines? Why classify the research? Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is not that Hutchison was mistaken, but that he was right in ways we still can't map. The Hutchison effect is a mirror held up to science itself. What do we do with observations that defy explanation? Do we investigate further or erase? Hutchison continued his work in private, despite restrictions, ridicule, and harassment. He believed he had stumbled on something essential, even if he couldn't fully control it. In a world that often demands repeatability before belief, he was a reminder that discovery sometimes begins with chaos, not control. So we ask, if the rules bent once, could they bend again? And what kind of world awaits on the other side of that bend? In the 1940s, deep in the Maine woods, a box sat silently in the corner of a dimly lit room. It wasn't plugged in. It had no moving parts. And yet those who stepped inside said they felt something: warmth, clarity, even healing. This was the orgone accumulator, the invention of psychiatrist Wilhelm Reich. Reich wasn't an engineer or physicist by training. He began as a student of Freud, exploring the relationship between the body and emotion. But he believed there was something more, a life force he called orgone. It wasn't a metaphor. To him, it was as real as electricity, invisible, omnipresent, and powerful. To capture it, he built boxes made of alternating layers of organic and metallic material. Patients would sit inside for sessions. Many reported reduced pain, improved mood, and in some cases, dramatic healing. Reich measured temperature increases inside the boxes that had no external heat source. Plants grew faster. Lab cultures changed. The boxes seemed to gather something ambient and make it available. But Reich's vision extended beyond medicine. He claimed orgone could influence weather, building massive cloudbusters that manipulated atmospheric energy. Witnesses described sudden rainfall, cloud dispersal, and localized climate shifts. His devices didn't emit anything. They simply interacted with what was already there. To Reich, orgone was the connective tissue of the universe, life, energy, psyche, and nature all entwined. But to the U.S. government, he was something else, a danger. In 1954, the Food and Drug Administration declared that orgone did not exist. They obtained an injunction that barred the distribution of his devices, even the mention of the word orgone in literature. The following year, federal agents raided his lab. They destroyed accumulators, burned his books, and confiscated research. Not just silenced, erased. Reich was imprisoned for contempt of court. He died in 1957 in a federal penitentiary. No trial for fraud, no public debate, just silence. His death marked not just the loss of a man, but the vanishing of an entire body of exploratory science. To this day, independent researchers claim the orgone accumulator has measurable effects: temperature anomalies, accelerated healing in plants and animals, inexplicable energetic responses. But mainstream science has never returned to examine it with fresh eyes. The stigma remains. Was Reich wrong? Or was he simply too far ahead, speaking in a language the world hadn't yet learned? He saw the body not as a machine, but as a field. Health wasn't just chemical, it was energetic. He imagined medicine not as attack, but as balance. His failure wasn't technological. It was cultural. Because if Reich was right, it meant energy surrounds us, not just in wires, but in life itself. That healing could come not from intervention, but from alignment. that the world's ailments, physical, psychological, ecological, might share a common thread. The destruction of his work raises a deeper question. Why do some ideas scare us so much that we burn them? Reich's boxes didn't promise immortality or miracle cures. They asked us to consider that vitality might be something we've forgotten how to see. In our modern world of high-speed diagnostics and digital metrics, the idea of sitting silently in a wooden box to absorb a life force seems quaint, perhaps absurd. But what if our discomfort isn't with the science, but with the simplicity? What if the energy we seek is already here, waiting, not to be extracted, but remembered? At the edge of the Florida Everglades, hidden behind a coral wall, stands a monument to obsession, a castle built not of bricks, but of questions. Massive blocks of limestone, some weighing over 30 tons, rise into strange formations. Gates that pivot with a single finger. Walls aligned with celestial precision. Coral Castle, they call it, and one man built it. Alone. Edward Leeds-Kalnin, a Latvian immigrant barely 5 feet tall and weighing just over 100 pounds, began construction in 1923. Working only at night, he refused visitors. Over 1,100 tons of coral rock were quarried, shaped, and lifted into place, using tools that looked too primitive to accomplish such feats. Tripods, chains, pulleys, nothing that could explain the scale, the precision, or the silence. He claimed he had discovered the secrets of the ancient Egyptians, how the pyramids were moved, how stones danced into place without cranes or dynamite. His notebooks were cryptic, filled with references to magnetic currents, polar alignments, and unknown forces. He spoke of magnetism not as force alone, but as a living interaction. Some witnesses said they saw the stones move, float even, drawn across the ground without friction, lifted without strain. They described humming, a soft vibration in the air. Then the stone would be in place, perfectly balanced, as if the earth had agreed to let go for a moment. Skeptics point to pulleys and counterweights. They say it's engineering, clever but explainable. Yet modern builders attempting to replicate the construction, even with heavy machinery, have struggled. The balance of the stones is too perfect. The effort required too great. After Leeds-Kalnin's death in 1951, investigators found unusual devices in his workshop: coils, magnets, radio equipment. Handwritten notes hinted at an understanding of magnetic fields not yet recognized by mainstream physics. He had been building more than a castle. He had been conducting an experiment in stone. Soon after his death, authorities sealed off the site. Equipment vanished. Research notes were confiscated. Whatever method he used, whatever technology he understood, was quietly removed from reach. To this day, Coral Castle remains a riddle carved into limestone. No definitive explanation, no blueprint. Just stones, perfectly still and impossible to forget. What if Leeds-Kalnin had tapped into something deeper? A resonance between earth and material, a method of lifting not through force, but through field. The ancients may have known something we lost, knowledge buried beneath centuries of forgetting. In Coral Castle, we see the trace of that forgotten language, of physics written not in equations, but in balance, a magnetism not of machines, but of intention. It challenges our assumptions, that power comes from size, that movement requires violence, that heavy things can only be lifted with heavier tools. What if there is another way? Leeds-Kalnin worked in obscurity without acclaim or profit. He left behind no followers, no disciples, only questions, heavy as stone and just as silent. He showed us that one person alone could move the immovable, and in doing so, he left us wondering not just how he did it, but why we ever believed it was impossible in the first place. It looked like a spinning ring of magnets moving in perfect rhythm. No wires, no fuel, just motion, endless, elegant, self-sustaining. In the 1960s, British engineer John Searl built what he called the Searl effect generator, or SEG. It wasn't just an engine, it was a revelation. At its core, the device consisted of a central magnetized disc surrounded by rolling magnets that orbited in concentric rings. As they moved, they generated electricity, not through combustion or friction, but through a kind of magnetic dance. The SEG produced power, seemingly from the very structure of space itself. Then something even stranger happened. The generator began to float. As it gained speed, the SEG's mass appeared to reduce. In some tests, it lifted off entirely, hovering silently. No propellers, no jets, just magnetism manipulating gravity, or bypassing it altogether. Witnesses described devices that levitated while powering lights and machines. Some reported electromagnetic effects that disrupted nearby electronics. Searl envisioned a world transformed, homes powered without a grid, vehicles that never needed fuel, spacecraft that hovered effortlessly, riding magnetic waves into orbit. A single device combining free energy and anti-gravity, a fusion of motion and field that defied industrial logic. But soon the dream unraveled. In 1968, British authorities raided his lab. The official reason, radio interference. But instead of correcting emissions, the entire operation was dismantled. Equipment destroyed, research notes seized. Searl was imprisoned for operating unlicensed electrical devices. When he emerged, his life's work had been erased. What had he discovered? Critics argue the SEG violates conservation laws. They say the levitation was illusion or misinterpretation, but no one has convincingly replicated or debunked it. And yet, attempts to revisit the design have faced consistent barriers: confiscated equipment, denied patents, vanished funding. It raises a troubling possibility that the issue was not scientific validity, but potential disruption. What happens when someone invents a power source that requires no fuel? That levitates? That removes dependence on grids, on pipelines, on entire industries? The SEG suggests that gravity and magnetism are not fixed forces, but tunable effects. That space is not empty, but alive with structure. That energy can emerge not from consumption, but from motion in harmony. If true, it would change everything: transportation, infrastructure, economics, control. And maybe that's why it disappeared. Searl continues his work in exile, building devices in obscurity, releasing footage that sparks debate, but rarely validation. The mainstream won't engage. The fringe embraces. And the world moves on, still tethered to combustion, still grounded by gravity. But the vision lingers. A world where energy hums, not roars, where machines glide, not grind, where motion is born not of violence, but of rhythm. The SEG was never just a machine. It was an invitation to reimagine how the universe gives us power and what it might look like if we learn to move with it instead of against it. What if the key to flight was not lift, but levity? And what if energy was not something to burn, but something to harmonize? The engine didn't roar. It whispered, not with combustion, but with implosion, spiraling inward like a whirlpool of air and water. In the 1940s, deep in the forests of Austria, inventor Victor Schauberger built machines unlike anything seen before. His engines didn't explode fuel to create force. They used nature's own motion, the vortex. Schauberger was a forester by trade, but a philosopher by instinct. He watched how water flowed in streams, how trout held still in fast currents without effort. He believed nature revealed its secrets not through equations, but through patterns. And one pattern above all fascinated him: implosion. Where most machines push, Schauberger's pulled. His repulsine engine created a spinning vortex that drew in air and water, compressing and cooling as it spun. The result was astonishing. Powerful thrust with almost no fuel, near zero heat, and virtually no noise. The engine ran more efficiently as it operated, seemingly drawing additional energy from the very motion it created. His devices also purified. The exhaust wasn't pollution, it was clean, charged air. Some versions even revitalized water, restoring its natural structure. He spoke of a living energy, biocosmic, that flowed through all matter. His machines didn't fight it, they joined it. During World War II, Nazi scientists took notice. Schauberger was forced to work on advanced aircraft projects. Under intense secrecy, his implosion engines were integrated into disc-shaped craft. Witnesses described vehicles with flight characteristics no conventional technology could explain: silent lift, rapid acceleration, fluid motion. When the war ended, American intelligence captured Schauberger's work. He was brought to the U.S., where he was interrogated, his prototypes confiscated, his notes copied. Then he was sent home, broken, disillusioned, and bound by contracts that forbade further development. He died in 1958, shortly after returning to Austria. His technology was never released. The reason, perhaps, lies in what it implied. Implosion engines challenge not only engineering norms, but industrial paradigms. They produce energy through inward motion, not outward destruction. They run clean, they heal, they mimic life. That's a threat, not just to oil, coal, and gas, but to the mindset that progress must be loud, hot, and violent. To this day, Schauberger's designs are studied by fringe scientists and eco-engineers. Some claim to have replicated aspects of his work. Others dismiss it as pseudoscience. But no one denies the brilliance of his observations, the elegance of his logic, the harmony of his vision. What if the future of energy isn't about domination, but cooperation? Schauberger believed that technology should imitate nature, not overpower it. That true power flows inward, not outward. His implosion engines weren't just mechanical, they were philosophical, a return to balance. He once said, "Comprehend and copy nature," but modern industry chose instead to conquer it. So the Repulsi Ein sits in a museum, like a relic from a forgotten path, a path where machines breathe, where motion nourishes, where engines heal. And we're left wondering, what kind of world might we live in had we chosen to spiral inward instead of burn outward? Can we still return to that path? Or has the whirlpool already passed us by? The ship vanished. On October 28, 1943, at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, an experiment began that would echo through history like a myth too persistent to ignore. The USS Eldridge, a Navy destroyer escort, was enveloped in a greenish-blue fog. A hum, then a flash, and it was gone. Minutes later, it reappeared hundreds of miles away in Norfolk, Virginia, before returning just as mysteriously to Philadelphia. This was the so-called Philadelphia experiment. According to those who claim to have witnessed it, the experiment was meant to test radar invisibility using intense electromagnetic fields. But what occurred seemed to go far beyond that. Teleportation, invisibility, dimensional shift. Some sailors were said to have emerged fused to the ship's bulkheads. Others suffered madness, disorientation, or vanished permanently. The science was rooted in speculative interpretations of Einstein's unified field theory, the idea that gravity and electromagnetism could be linked and manipulated. Tesla's earlier work reportedly influenced the project. The Navy, of course, has always denied it took place, but fragments of testimony, leaked letters, and scattered reports kept the story alive. Dr. Morris Jessup, an astrophysicist, investigated claims from supposed witnesses. He received detailed accounts of what had happened on the Eldridge, accounts that painted a picture of a successful but uncontrolled manipulation of space and time. Jessup's own life would end under mysterious circumstances, fueling speculation that the truth had once again been silenced. What if the experiment did happen? Not exactly as the stories tell it, but enough to raise uncomfortable questions. Could electromagnetic fields distort the very structure of space? Could a ship and its crew be shifted out of sync with the rest of the physical world? If such technologies were ever real, their implications would be staggering. Instant transport, invisibility, dimensional travel, but also danger. Human minds and bodies unprepared for the stress of existing between moments. The experiment, if real, may have succeeded too well and revealed a door better left closed. The official records are clean. The Eldridge was accounted for. The Navy insists the story is fiction. But what's most interesting is not whether the ship vanished, but why the story refuses to. We are drawn to tales where reality bends, where the firm lines of time and space ripple like water. We long to believe that the limits we live under, distance, time, gravity, are not absolute. But with that belief comes fear. If we can manipulate reality, what else becomes unstable? The Philadelphia experiment stands at the crossroads of war, secrecy, and imagination. Whether myth or memory, it serves as a symbol of how far we're willing to go to reach beyond the known, and how high the price may be when we do. In a time of global conflict with science sprinting ahead of ethics, perhaps the real story is not the ship, but the pattern. When technology leaps too far, too fast, it often disappears, into secrecy, into denial, or into myth. And so we ask, if the USS Eldridge truly vanished, where did it go? And if it never did, why does the world still believe that it could? Scattered across decades and continents, the pattern begins to emerge, not in circuits or blueprints, but in silence, in confiscated notes, in burned documents, in quiet warnings. These were not isolated events. The erased inventions we've explored form a constellation, each point a flash of possibility, snuffed out before its light could spread. Tesla's tower humming with radiant energy, Rife's microscope singing cancer into remission, Brown's discs defying gravity with charged air, Keely's motors vibrating into motion, Hutchison's field where metal bent like rubber, Reich's boxes collecting something unnameable, Leeds-Kalnin's coral blocks floating into place, Searl's generators spinning into levitation, Schauberger's engines imploding into motion, the Eldridge flickering out of time. Each offered a new way to see the world, through frequency, magnetism, vortex, resonance. Each posed not just a technological challenge, but a cultural one. They didn't fit neatly into our established models of energy, health, physics, or economics. And so they were hidden, discredited, or forgotten, not because they were failures, but because they worked differently. In every case, the consequences of success threatened powerful systems. Free energy destabilizes industries. Cures disrupt profits. Gravity control dismantles warfare as we know it. Instant transport erases borders. Implosion over explosion rewrites the logic of consumption. And so, quietly, each was buried. Not with a bang, but with a memo. A raid, a seized patent, a shuttered lab, an unexplained death. This isn't about conspiracy in the cartoonish sense. It's about inertia, how institutions protect themselves, how changes resist when it threatens not just comfort, but control. The suppression is systemic, not personal, bureaucratic, not theatrical, and yet the cost is deeply human. How many lives might have been saved if cancer could be treated with tuned frequencies instead of chemotherapy? How much pollution avoided if Schauberger's implosion principles had powered our cities? How might our relationship with the planet have changed if energy were drawn from the air instead of mined from its core? The true tragedy is not what was taken, but what was never allowed to become, a golden age imagined and deferred. But these stories remain. They whisper through time, defying erasure. They survive in amateur replications, obscure archives, first-hand accounts too stubborn to disappear. They remind us that innovation isn't always nurtured by consensus, that sometimes it blooms on the margins, only to be cut down before it can seed. And so we return to the question, what kind of world might we live in had we chosen differently? What would it mean to value the outlier, to fund the heretic? To follow the invention that asks not for wires or gas or surgery, but for a shift in how we think? These erased technologies are not just curiosities. They are mirrors. They reflect what we fear, what we protect, and what we might become. The future isn't only what we invent. It's also what we allow, what we permit ourselves to imagine, and what we refuse to suppress. So we stand now in the silence left behind by vanished machines, unspoken knowledge, and unanswered questions. And the final question may not be, were these inventions real, but rather, what kind of world are we afraid to create? In a room somewhere, there's a locked drawer. Inside it may be a coil, a circuit, a scribbled formula, or perhaps just a journal, yellowed and brittle, filled with ideas too strange to share. Across decades, such drawers have multiplied, in labs, in basements, in the archives of forgotten geniuses. What connects them is not what they contain, but what they represent. Possibilities we were not ready to accept. Somewhere along the line, human progress became curated. We tell ourselves a story of continual advancement, each generation building on the last, science moving like a train on tracks. But what if some tracks were deliberately torn up? What if the path of technology was not determined by discovery alone, but by permission? Take the Inventions Secrecy Act, an obscure U.S. policy that allows the government to classify civilian patents deemed a threat to national security. Thousands of inventions have been hidden this way, many never resurfacing. Energy devices, communication systems, materials with strange properties. Most will never be seen again. Why? Because knowledge is power. And power, real structural power, does not welcome disruption. Free energy destabilizes energy markets. Gravity control undermines transportation industries. Non-invasive healing challenges pharmaceutical empires. Each breakthrough, if realized, would require not just new tools, but new systems, new ways of living, new values. The suppression is not only technological, it's philosophical. A world built on scarcity has little room for abundance. An economy built on competition struggles to embrace cooperation. A culture of ownership resists a paradigm of sharing. And yet invention continues, quietly, relentlessly. Tinkerers still build in garages. Researchers explore the forbidden edges of physics. Whisper networks of independent thinkers exchange blueprints, build prototypes, and dream in frequencies, harmonics, and fields. They are not chasing fame. They are preserving possibility. What unites these forgotten inventions is not just their function. It's their challenge to the idea that control must be centralized, that energy must be sold, that truth must be approved. Each device we've explored, real or speculative, proven or imperfect, invites a different question. Not does it work, but what if it had been allowed to? This isn't about nostalgia. It's about agency. Because the world we live in is not the only world we could have. It is the result of decisions, some made in public, others behind closed doors, some with data, others with fear. There is no guarantee that unlocking these ideas would lead to utopia. Every technology brings risks, unintended consequences. But suppression is not safety. It is stagnation. And perhaps the most radical act we can take is to ask again and again, what are we not being shown? What questions are not being asked? What drawers remain unopened? The future is not a destination. It's a choice, made daily, quietly, in the margins. And those margins may yet hold the answers to questions we've barely dared to ask, not just about machines or energy or physics, but about ourselves. What kind of civilization do we want to be? The kind that hoards what it fears, or the kind that listens to the whisper of impossible ideas and dares to follow them? The dust has settled. The machines, if they ever existed, have gone silent. The labs have closed. The inventors have passed into memory, their names carved not into stone, but into whispered stories and speculative footnotes. And yet something remains. Not the devices themselves, but the space they opened, the questions they left behind. Across these 14 chapters, we've walked the borders of science and silence. We've looked not just at what was built, but at what was buried. The pattern is clear. Discoveries that promised too much freedom, too much disruption, too much change, were often not celebrated, but erased. What binds these stories together isn't proof, it's potential. Each inventor glimpsed a future unlike the one we inherited, one of decentralized energy, healing through resonance, transportation without combustion, materials shaped by fields, not factories, a world where knowledge served life, not markets. But for such a world to emerge, we would need more than invention. We would need permission. Permission to rethink our economic models, to question what science funds and what it forbids, to let go of systems that prioritize profit over possibility. That is the deeper truth these stories reveal, that technological progress is not limited by our imagination, but by our institutions. That for every breakthrough that reaches us, others are filtered out, not because they fail the test of science, but because they fail the test of power. We began with a question: what happens to an idea when it arrives before its time? Perhaps the answer is this: it waits. In fragments, in stories, in the quiet persistence of those who build not for approval, but for truth. And so the question returns to us. Are we ready now? Ready to imagine energy not as a commodity, but as a birthright. To see healing not just in medicine, but in vibration, in balance, in light. To explore gravity, time, and matter not as fixed barriers, but as flexible, even collaborative elements of reality. The inventions we've explored may never return in their original forms. Their blueprints may be lost. Their creators silenced. But the spirit behind them is still alive. It lives in every open question, in every experiment conducted outside the margins, in every refusal to accept that what is all that can be. What these erased inventions offer is not nostalgia. It is agency, a chance to reclaim our role not just as consumers of progress, but as participants in it. We don't need to believe every claim to feel the pull of the idea beneath them, that the world can be different, that it already is. We just haven't caught up. So let this not be an ending, but an invitation to look deeper, to ask more, to challenge the silence, because the future we build will not be decided by what we already know. It will be shaped by the questions we still dare to ask. And somewhere, out there, the next impossible invention is waiting, not just to be discovered, but to be allowed. Will we let it in?